wanted to discuss, and I know there's a lot of interest in it, the notion of paying for ecosystem services. So this notion of the farmer's role being a bigger one than just being a food producer, that he or she is also the producer of services. It could be around biodiversity or education, recreation, cultural services. There's a whole bunch of them there. But how does a farmer make a living from that? So there's quite a bit of science around that, and James is the man to talk about that for sure. And also the policies which will inform it, but also the market, food market, and even private investment is becoming a big thing now. So we're going to tease that out over the next, I suppose, hour and 5 minutes. We'll finish by 1, but that's the purpose of it. James, do you want to say anything by way of introduction before we move to the panel?
Yeah, I think it is. There's a lot of work going on in the background now, both on the science side. We have this concept of natural capital and trying to value land for a complete range of services. And there's a realization, I think, among policy as well, that we want these range of services from the land. We have to value it more, and particularly in the UK, when they've left with Brexit going on no more. All the narrative is around public payments for public goods, you know, but it also links back to the narrative then that a lot of the public payments so far have been underpinning a cheap food system. So you can only transfer the public payments for public goods alongside that when we also need food and fibre, that we fix the market system, that it also rewards the food that we actually need. And that. So I think that's the bigger picture that we'll probably touch on various aspects of this. I think the important thing on this session will be is that we're sort of coming to a common understanding in terms of the examples from the farms here, that we get a good idea of what their thoughts are, what they have on their land, how we actually value that, how the challenges they have, and then bring it all together in terms of where we're going. I think it's
brilliant.
Yeah.
So that's great. So we might start with our wonderful panel. So first of all, we're going to go to County Roscommon and Padraig Corcoran, and Padraig farms near Lecaro. So maybe Padraig, to start off with, a little bit about your farming system for the audience.
We're in a little village called Lecaro in County Roscommon, and our farm is this sport. It's a unique bit of a holding really, because we have some very good upland, and that leads down, you know, it's the natural hedgerows and all, that leads on to a broadleaf semi-natural woodland, then onto wet woodland, onto wetlands, then you have we're onto the Lecaro Canal, which is part of the Lochrie SAC. So a lot of our land will be in an SAC as well as ordinary farmland. And then within the middle of all that, there's an old estate house which has a walled garden and the old buildings. So we have a lot of old built heritage, but to be the living heritage. And it's a farm that lends itself lovely to high nature value farming. But it's a farm that, you know, during the winter, it completely changes. There's part of the land would have 4 feet of water on it. You get all your wetland birds, your migratory birds, you know, you get that going off, and then you get you get all your breeding waders and all that during it, and then you get the grazing of that ground for the summer. So I suppose the winter is our most challenging time, and it's probably our most beautiful time, you know, because during the summer we have too much grass and, you know, we get curtailed. So it's the job of balancing and managing that, right? Well, what do we farm? We farm sheep, and we have suckler cows and a few beef. Now, we have got into a system really that we no longer carry the beef over the winter because it's too challenging. We haven't the sheds, we haven't the ground really for all the slurries. Slurry is something I'm not a fan of anyway. So and the sheep work ideally with it. On the woodlands, it's lovely because when we get our season has changed so much now that we're getting colder, less growth in February or March and April, and we have our woodlands that's like our outdoor shed, and the woodlands is at its best at that time of year because it is competing to get ahead. The ground growth is competing to get ahead of the canopy closing over. So we have all the vegetation pushing on, and we're not getting that east wind and that cold within the wood. So it works very well for our lambs and our sheep in it. And that's, you know, look, we started a biodiversity project in 2005, and I suppose we work sensitively with nature and with what's there, and that's what we do.
Thanks, Padraig. So that's a great case in point of a whole suite of ecosystem services, from the food, the different food products, to the biodiversity, to the carbon. And of course, you didn't mention the fact as well, you have a few boats there for hire on Lough Ree, which is a great recreational and educational experience.
That's an aspect of, you know, we look, and I think in the future farmers are going to need to look at that, how much more they have other than just, you know, farming doesn't just have to be about animals. Animals is the most essential part of land management. But within that land management, we're going to be looking at our habitats, our nature, our biodiversity, our carbon. And I think that that's where the future in able to support the farmer with probably having, there's a lot of farmers that doesn't need to reduce the number of animals. They're the ones that's doing things well, that's keeping all that gene pool there, but is not getting rewarded for it. And I think that it's going to have to tilt towards helping that person to maintain the habitats if we're going to prevent the loss of a lot of what we have.
Perfect. So we're going to move north now to Cavan and Jane Shackleton. Jane, so tell us a bit about your farm and your farming system.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. I suppose we're only just about in Cavan. We're on the Cavan-Meath border, so I suppose we farm about 120 acres of just the start of Drumlin country, so fairly dry land for Cavan, and probably about a third of it would be good Meath land. I suppose our farming system, and I farm alongside my parents, Daphne and Jonathan, who are here. We've probably been there about 30 years now. So we inherited a farm which had always been farmed very extensively. So we were very lucky starting from that baseline. Very naturally diverse grasslands, had never been high input, and, you know, stocked with a few suckler cows and a closed system, I suppose, for the past 50, 60 years. Our system, we've been organic for nearly 30 years now with the Irish Organic Association. And I suppose Mum would be a botanist, Dad would be an ecologist, so it was always really behind the decision about how to farm. We all work off-farm as well, so we have the luxury of being able to manage it in that regard. We haven't gone to farm it intensively, and probably, you know, financially could have earned more off it. So I think that's an important point. We've had that luxury to manage it in the way that we do. So we run about 30 suckler cows, and we finish everything to beef. So again, we've chosen traditional breeds, most very common in organic systems, Angus, Belted Galloways, and stabilizers as well. So 100% grass-fed. I suppose on the grassland side of things, we've reseeded with red clover and things like that on small areas, but we really want to preserve the natural grasslands that we have too, so I suppose different functions within the farm. Alongside the suckler system, we planted probably about a third of the farm into commercial forestry, but I suppose very diverse woodland. So we have 2 blocks of that. One's coming up to about 25 years old, and then a younger plantation as well. And we're moving, I suppose, towards a continuous cover system on those. We also manage them, I suppose, because we've done a certain amount of thinning ourselves, we can manage them in a kind of accidental agroforestry kind of way and graze our stock through that in the shoulder seasons. So, but I think overall our ethos has been, you know, producing organic grass-fed beef, but again, producing habitats, high biodiversity rich pastures and areas along the farm. So we've kind of always valued those things equally, but still, I suppose, trying to have a commercial operation as well. So that's
what a wonderful picture of a farm. It's just fantastic. It's like the dream of like how a multifunctional farming system in the modern 21st century context should look like. It's amazing. Plus, I assume there's a whole well-being impact as well for your parents being botanists and ecologists. I'm sure they probably get a lot of satisfaction from that particular system. One quick question. when you sell your animals, is any of those additionalities reflected in the price that you get for your meat at the moment?
And I suppose that's a lot of people in this space would say, oh, diversify, sell direct. We don't do that. We sell direct to a processor. Obviously, with organic, you get a slight premium. We find at the moment that works for us. So, yeah, we get the organic premium and on the cattle that we finish, yeah.
Okay. So we'll just go back to Roscommon again. We would never want to be too far from Roscommon. And the man who you'll all know, and we all have such huge respect for, Tommy Earley. Tommy's been at this game a good while now, but Tommy, maybe to remind the audience of your farming system and I suppose the outputs from that.
Yeah. Well, I'm farming on the shores of Loch Allen. I'm farming 100 acres. And in that, I have some forestry. I have 20 acres of forestry, I have 25 acres of bog, and the rest is grasslands on it. I'm farming suckler cows, and I'm bringing the calves to weanling stage, and I'm selling them in the local organic mart in Drumshambo. So along with the sucklers on the farm, I'm able to offer social farming as well on the farm, where for anyone that's not familiar with it, it's where people in the care services come onto your farm maybe one day a week and work along with you as you're doing your work. And it's not a work placement, but it's only a fairly new initiative in the country, but there's 3 or 4 social farms in most counties. And I think in terms of resources or using a farm for something good, I think it's possibly one of the best things you could do with your farm. Also along with that, we're growing a bit of vegetables on the farm, small scale up to this, but I'm hoping with the local Leitrim Organic Farmers Co-op next year to get going on a bigger scale. Also on the farm we do some farm tours as well, mostly local schools and various interest groups that come onto the farm. So yeah, so that's kind of what we're doing.
And I suppose you could say as well, Tommy, you're doing a bit of work around the carbon between the peat and the forestry as well. That would be another activity of yours, well, ponds as well, of course, but
yeah.
You're, I guess, supporting a research institution in Queen's University to some degree by making your land available and working with them on research?
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to be working with Dr. Raymond Flynn from Queen's University in Belfast, and we're part of a local group, Mount Allen Residents Association. So we're restoring the area bog that's on the farm, and basically, and there's a lot of farmers in our area that own small areas of bog, but at the moment they're not getting any farm payments on them. So we've been looking at how you can restore a bog and get it actively taken, to restore it that it's taken in the carbon and storing it, so that looking to see what would be maybe the cheapest way you could go about doing that. And so that you could, in the future, there will be farm payments towards storing carbon on your farm, but that farmers could actually be incentivised to restore some of the bogs, because we're only starting to appreciate bogs in this country, really. And to think that we'd say for 3% of the land mass, they store something like 30% of the carbon. You know, bogs are fabulous places, and we haven't been managing them very well up to this, but we need to start appreciating them, and hopefully we will in the future get them more back to what they would do naturally, which is storing the carbon for us.
Yeah, I think when we're listening to you here now, I see so much potential value in all this. We obviously see the obvious things from the woodland and from the animals themselves. We see the food and the fibre, but in the way you described your land, we also see from the point of view of the wetlands and the peatlands, we see carbon storage, climate adaptation too, in terms of flood mitigation and water storage in particular in the areas you've described, and the amount of water that's stored on your land that isn't flowing downstream through the Shannon and flooding Limerick, for example, when we have high rainfall events. We also see this huge amounts of nature, and even some of the stuff that you mentioned there on the social side and on the well-being side, this whole aspect of social farming. So we have all these aspects coming through now on the science side. And people are now trying to, across the university system, across the research system, across Europe and globally, trying to actually quantify what these services are. So how much carbon is stored in different ecosystems, how you manage land to store water and mitigate against climate change in particular areas, how much nature is in particular areas, and how we actually then come up with a system of actually valuing that and paying for that. So the science is trying to maybe a bit behind the value you already recognise in your land. And in particular, I think the policy is another step further behind that in terms of recognising that. And I think this is where we need to, I think a lot of the systems that you've said, one thing that really resonated with me when you, Jane, said, is you said, we have the luxury to farm this way. That there is something, and this is what, when I'm talking to students in the college as well, like, they see this as a luxury, So, and that points to a fundamental flaw in the system, Society needs the food, needs the fibre, needs the climate mitigation and the carbon storage, needs the water storage, needs the nature, and above all, in the modern society, we need this well-being and the social interaction aspects as well, But we are not valuing it in the system. So I think this is where we need to go to in this session, is how can we come up with systems where this is no longer a luxury? This is the ultimate goal I think we need to be getting to with policy change, and I think we're nearly getting to a stage that we can no longer afford incremental changes in policy. And one of the things we see with the backlash and trying to even change the CAP system as it is at the moment, there's a real resistance to any sort of change because farmers realise that their very existence and putting food on the table is very dependent on the subsidies. So there is this big level of mistrust that when you change the system, that they're going to be taken out of the loop and it's going to be made more difficult for them. So I think the real sense is science needs to catch up and value this and understand it. But then, as we talked about yesterday, I think it's very important that we don't run away with the complexity of the science, that we reel it in a bit and we understand the complexity, but we can come up with very relatively simple systems for valuing and paying for this. And this is what we've been trying to work on in the Burn now for over 10 years and trying to replicate this across Europe. Globally, it's called Payment for Ecosystem Services. In this context, we call it results-based payment systems. And I think we often think of ourselves as world leaders in terms of agriculture. And is there any country in the world that's getting this right? Now, I haven't looked into it an awful lot, but from what I've seen, the cursory look, Costa Rica. A South American developing third world country, and all the sustainability indexes in terms of land use and development is the one that's at the top all the time, So I think it's a misnomer for Ireland to say we're on this journey to sustainability, and Orange and Green always say we're on a journey, But by God, we need to start getting there a bit more rapidly, So there's no longer, other countries are passing us out. We have basically countries in South America that we always hear about, Brazil, Argentina, we always highlight in the narrative the bad ones. But there is South American countries that have passed us out and gone ahead of us. So I think it is incumbent on us now, the rest of this session, is understanding, I think these are 3 excellent case studies that at the moment it's their drive, their sense of responsibility to the land, and also maybe in some way being able, based on the economic circumstances, and having this luxury to actually be able to do this. That should not be the case. And until we actually turn that around in terms of this is where you actually make the money. I think, coming back to what we said yesterday, we can't be in the green if we're in the red. We have to create a system where the pathway out of the red is green, and you can only go that way, So I think this sets this lovely in the scene to open it up maybe a bit in terms of how we can do that, building on this system.
Exactly, but I think from Noel's point in the first section, I think we need to be conscious. I mean, you're all committed to what you do, you love what you do, you're bought in. But I think to think about the majority in the middle, as Noel referenced, the Trumpism. We won't use that word today, but yes. How do you give them the economic signals so that they end up doing at least some of what you guys are doing? I think that's the challenge this morning. So maybe just one more round with the panel and then we'll go to the audience.
Yeah,
Padraig, do you
I
feel
was trying to think of something last night just to keep it simple, and we'll say to include the word nature within what farmers do, that what they are doing. Like it's nature what they're doing with their animals and everything, and how to manage their land, and it's how to do that. And I suppose if you were to look at if the farm positive for nature or negative for nature, and I suppose the more intensive it gets, the more negative it gets for nature. So the simple balance of what to do and reward them for their positive side of what to do for nature. And that, nature positive or nature negative.
I think you were making a point yesterday, Shirley, about carbon positive or carbon neutral or carbon negative, but you're saying something similar for nature, if the balance is positive?
If you think of it, it's water quality, it's air quality, it's biodiversity, it's habitats, and that's all nature positive, Then you look at your intensive side, you're looking at what you're putting in your sprays, your fertilizers, all your higher emissions, your greenhouse gases and all that. And that's your nature negative, And it's a very simple way. People understand then, if I do this, I'm negative. If I do the other, I'm positive. And there should be an encouragement and a rewardment for what to do for their positive stuff.
Yeah.
And nature positive, I think, would be...
And if we stick just with the scientific piece, and maybe James will come in on this in the end, you've worked with scientists and ecologists on your farm before. Do you think it's possible to measure your outputs in terms of beyond the food and beyond maybe what people pay to go out on the boat? Do you find it's possible to put a value or a measurement on those things?
Well, I suppose ecotourism is the fastest growing tourism sector in the world. And people come to see results, So if the results and stuff is there and people enjoy what they come and see, that's a positive, healthy lifestyle, so it is. It's an enjoyment. But it's also, that's keeping the gene pool there within it, and it's making people conscious of what they have and want to improve it a little bit, So when you're doing your farming then, you think, well, if I do too much of this, is it going to impact on that, And rewards will be there. There's a huge amount to be gained within the next number of years with education and everything, because there's going to be a whole lot more compiling of data of what people have and the ability to store and, your water quality and everything and how we treat our water. And I think as well that there has to something come into play. It doesn't make sense to be putting millions and millions and millions of euro into flood defensive systems within concrete and everything. When we have the areas of land, if we look on our old ordnance survey map, liable for flooding is on huge amount of places. But a lot of these places that you look at this map, there hasn't been flooding on them in years because they've been drained and drained and drained. But where have they gone into? That somebody that was liable for flooding is now a permanent floodplain. Do you know what I'm saying? So that we will have to look at how we manage our wetlands, and a lot of our wetlands as well hasn't been managed on a farming term very well either, because it has got more difficult. Labour isn't available. Machinery has got heavier. Abandonment of land has had a huge negative effect on a lot of our biodiversity and our nature. People think, oh, sure, it's left there on its own. But it's not, because a lot of these places was where your migratory birds came for the winter. Some of them stood and was nesting areas and everything. And that has been lost, So then that, and that is on a decline then on the species.
And Jane, you're a scientist and a farmer to some degree. I know you do a certain amount of research as well. Do you think it's possible to kind of capture like those wonderful outputs from your land in a way that will give a farmer an economic signal to manage the land in such a way? Do you think it's possible to assimilate all the complexity in a very simple economic signal to the farmer with regard to what he or she does on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I suppose we're seeing that already, through EIPs and, I suppose what I like to see is farmer-led research and monitoring themselves, if they get the right advice and guidance, which I think a lot of the time outside of more marginal parts of this country is lacking, especially in the east and southeast. So I think we really need to make an effort to give more knowledge at advisory level, at third level, to farmers to empower themselves to be able to monitor what they're doing and give them an awareness to it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting notion as well, the redefining what it means to be a farmer. Part of that is maybe becoming a scientist and monitoring the outcomes. Tommy, you're working with the scientists at the moment. Do you feel confident that the end product of working with Queen's will give you something that you can use and that other farmers can use to measure their carbon sequestration?
Yeah, well, the work we're doing with Queens is we're trialling different plots on that area of raised bog, and that's the idea, that farmers will be able to come and see those plots and see how the job was done, and in a lot of cases they'll be able to do the work themselves. So then they can go back to their own area of bog and put in place those measures, and then it will restore the proper conditions on the bog for them, that will start to store the carbon. But yeah, I suppose it's good. We'll say in terms of carbon capture, that's where the future will be, and it's something that we have to learn more about. But I think you spoke there about putting a value on farms and everything. But I think social farm in Ireland, I think they're kind of maybe ahead of the game at this stage, in that they recognise the farmer's time as being very valuable. And where the social farming is working is where the participants are coming out onto the farm. The farmer is getting payment while those participants are there. So they recognise the value of what the farmer is doing in social farming.
So that's a very direct transaction that, it makes sense. You're providing a service and you're being paid for that. I'm going to go to James in a minute, but just maybe to give you a little bit of kind of an anecdote from the Burren, and then we'll maybe go to the audience in a minute. But like I know in the Burren, a good few years ago, I've been lucky in my life to work with some of the best scientists. You could wish for, James included, and Sharon Parr, a colleague of mine. And the Burren is an incredibly complex ecosystem. It really is like a field this size could have 10 different habitats, all of them radically different, from wetland to some of the driest ground you'll have. And then you've got quite complex farming systems on top of it, depending on the breakdown of the farm between the lowland and the upland. Very, very complex. But about 10 years ago, we felt that farmers were just getting one economic signal, and it was for the production of meat. So it made sense for them to clear all those habitats to produce uniform grassland in order to produce more meat. And not only that, but you look like you're being progressive at the same time. So at the time, we kind of figured that we're going to have to give a different stimulus to farmers, which will make them reconsider maybe removing these habitats and leaving the bit of wetland and leaving maybe the bit of woodland and leaving the bit of rough grazing, species rich, and to try and tie that payment into those ecosystem services. Now, it sounded like a bit daunting, but sometimes you just dive right in. And Sharon, God bless her, she created a very simple 10-point scoring system to capture the biodiversity, water quality and cultural heritage on each field within the farm on a 0 to 10 basis. And I know Dennis is one of the farm advisors here who applies that scoring system. It's been running for 12 years in the Burren very successfully. So we're basically paying those farmers for these specific ecosystem services. The beauty of it is that the taxpayer can see what he or she is getting, and if they're not getting it, they're not paying for it. The farmer has total freedom to farm, whether he wants to do a Tommy Earley on it, or do a Padraig or a Jane on it, and or whether they want to do very little at all. They have total freedom into how they farm and how they produce these services, or if they produce these services. And I suppose it also provides for the scientists monitoring of whether these programs are working or not. And that's just a little anecdote, but it does work well. It's not perfect, but it does work well. The complexity can be overcome. But what's really interesting is kind of what happened next, and that's where I want to go to James, because now we're talking about multiple services like carbon and water storage and fire prevention and all these things. But James might talk a bit about how the science has really accommodated all that complexity through new scorecards and new programs and so on.
So with starting with Sharon's scorecard, remember the opportunity came up for funding to expand the Burren into maybe this results-based system. And I think it was 2008 and 2009. And there was a mad panic going through the science, the evidence base, and coming up with a scorecard based on Swiss and Canadian systems, in the space of 6 weeks. So Sharon was trying to distill the complexity of the science, how it worked into this simple 10-point scoring system. And I think that, to me, was the eureka moment. I think watching Sharon doing that over that 6-week period, and showing that it could be done. And then we had to make sure that model was robust. It was put in place and it was tried. And every time we've come back to it, whether it be Dara Stanley's work, who's now in UCD, and it was in Trinity and NUIG at the time, testing to see how the pollinators correlated with that 10 point score. It worked for the pollinators at the time. So when the score was high based on Sharon's original scoring, the pollinators were also high. So it worked for that. So then we said this should be able to work in other systems as well, on other types of land beside this. So we tried to put these same, knowing the existing science that's there, trying to capture the complexity of that, come up with simple variables that can be measured on farm, like you'd condition score a field or a cow or anything, the same principles, and apply that to condition scoring. And can we do it for carbon? Can we do it for pollinators? Can we do it for the plants? Can we do it for water? These key services that aren't paid for by the market at the moment. And what we've come up with now with the EIPs is what in the scientific terms we're calling them multi-criteria assessments of ecosystem services. To the farmer, there's a 10-point scoring system that when the score goes up, I get more payment for it. But there's a lot of science behind that. We're continuously trying to refine the variables. Work we've done in the last 4 years in particular, Sarah, one of the PhD students just finished on it, she was working with scientists in Trinity, in DCU on the soil side, so the pollinators in Trinity, the soil scientists in DCU, working with Teagasc as well, working with NUI Galway on pest control as well, trying to the same basic scoring system. And I remember very well one day she was trying to model the pollinators across a large landscape in Sligo and Wexford, across very different intensive landscape. She set up the model, don't need to worry about the details of it, it had all these multiple variables put in. It was put into the computer, and this pollinator model, it's on an international, basically, model that looks at ecosystem services. It took 7 days for the computer to run through all the iterations. Now, the computer only cost us $2,000. It might have taken only a day if we had a computer that was worth $10,000, you know. But it went through all these different iterations, multiple iterations of testing this, and it fired out at the end to us essentially that, well, if we have more of this semi-natural vegetation and if we have more of it in this quality with the nesting areas and the foraging areas that the pollinators need, you will have more pollinators, you know. So that basically confirmed, again, what we've done on the scorecards. So then on the scorecards, all we do is then, if you want to pay for pollinators, the habitats they require, which is semi-natural vegetation, producing more flowers, with a continuous supply of flowers throughout the season, you put in a simple variable in a scoring card, pay farmers for where their semi-natural vegetation is for pollinators, and you pay for having a continuous supply of these floral resources, the scientists would say, throughout the season. So again, all that 4 years' work, with multiple scientists across the country, with their links internationally as well, feeding into this pollinator model, and it can come out, and we have to go out on a farm and measure habitat type that's present, give them a different score, and if the quality of that is X or Y, give it a higher payment again. We can do the same thing for carbon. Interestingly, on the Carbon Connect's working with Queen's and their international network as well. Some of the figures I've seen coming out from them is that a peatland in poor condition that has a lot of bare soil on it is emitting something like 6 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum, just spilling it into the atmosphere. So it is. But if that's re-wetted and brought into good condition, it can be actually sequestering approximately 1 tonne of carbon per hectare, just roughly speaking. It can be anything from 0.2 up to 1, and it could change with climate change. There's multiple things that come into it. But that's a turnaround of 7 tonnes of carbon per hectare, which is absolutely massive. You're talking rainforest levels of carbon sequestration here in terms of that sort of a turnaround. So again, what we need to do in that, all that is said, we have peatlands when they're in good conditions with sphagnum mosses growing on them. Again, just measure 2 indicators, degree of wetness and the types of these vegetation growing on them. Again, we can come up with a payment for carbon on this. And then in the carbon farming, there's been a handbook published by the European Commission in June. And basically what they've said in terms of the next round of carbon farming markets should be based on these results-based payments, and the indicators are saying, actually it's some people we worked with before, are coming up with the same indicators that are already used in some of the EIP scoring cards in terms of amount of build-up of litter and having these sphagnum on the peatland scorecard. So I think we can wait for the science to do this, but a lot of the things we can go ahead, like Sharon done in the space a couple of weeks, put the scoring systems and the payment systems in place. Have the science working on the background, making sure this works and tweaking it every so often. But I think we can be there with the political will to actually come up with these payments for ecosystem services and having farmers being paid on this in the next round of CAP.
And I think that's really helpful, and to know that that science can handle this or is in the process of handling it. We don't necessarily need to wait. I mean, the other two well-known projects would be the hen harrier project, where we're basically rewarding farmers who create habitats suitable for the hen harrier. But even more interesting, I think, in Kerry is the freshwater pearl mussel project. This pearl mussel requires clean water, so there's a scoring system which will capture, at a farm level, what contribution that farmer is making to clean water. If it's a positive one, you get more money. If it's a negative one, you get nothing. So there is ways of doing that. But what I wanted to explore with the panel, and Jane, did you?
Yeah, I just have a question, sorry, James, about that. I suppose uptake into projects like EIPs on the really profitable sectors like dairying, and who do not need payments for ecosystem services, and how you engage farmers who are commercially doing very well in schemes like that.
I think this has worked very, very well on the extensive high nature value farmers where they're already dependent on the subsidies. So then you can change the direction of the subsidies to actually pay for another service. Where they're doing very well commercially out of the production of the food, then it's key, and we've seen some moves with Carberry and some of the other more progressive, I would call, co-ops, so that to actually build that value into it. So we have to, in that situation, where the vast majority of the money is coming from not an environmental market, but a food market, then farmers that are producing the additional services have to be getting the bonus through these as well. So I think this is more of a policy thing than a science thing. You have to actually make sure, it's about making sure that the farmer is getting the right signal. And ultimately, the co-ops that are selling this on are selling into a more environmentally conscious consumer all the time. So I think it's really on their radar if they don't actually build some of these same types of scoring systems into a grading system of environmental quality for the product. And then it needs, which is another big problem, clear labelling of food produce, and we don't even have the clear labelling in terms of country of origin. So I'm not saying this is going to be easy, but we know the steps that need to be taken to make it happen. And I think you're probably in the area that you're working with, you're in UCD at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah.
So you're probably having more discussions about this and more contacts in with the co-ops, are you? And I know there's the Farm Zero carbon project as well. That's
I'd be Doubt with Devonish.
Oh, you're in Doubt at Devonish,
which is similar.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's an issue around enforcement as well and compliance on some of those places to stop the negative activity. But I think, James, what you're saying is that if somebody's producing milk which has a much higher biodiversity footprint and water quality footprint within that farm, that should be recognised in the price that farmer gets per litre.
And of course, I think above all, we have to move into a baseline regulation. You can't have a situation that society is paying for the actual damage and these what the economists call negative externalities that no one is picking up at the moment.
So what I wanted to do is maybe bring the audience in here today, because this is kind of a relatively new way of thinking, and the panel as well. What do you feel about that? Do you feel this is like a negative thing? You're kind of commodifying something that's very special, and it's a negative force? Do you think it's possibly too complicated? Do you think it's too expensive? Do you think it has a future? And we'll maybe get onto the policy side of things in a minute as well. So there's a question here from Thomas, and we've one here from Noel. So the microphone is just coming, Thomas, if you hang on.
There's an economic incentive to get farmers to treat the land. But there's actually already one of those, except it is negative. It's that the amount of land I see around me that's cleared because it's not productive ground. Where farmers, they would have left that corner of the field, or I'd hate to think of the amount of glyphosate and stuff bought over the last few years, simply because the department sends out a map, and unless the farmers cleared a bit of ground and have just ryegrass on it, if they have rushes or if they have trees, then there is a signal there, except it's negative. Talamh Bio, when we put in our CAP proposal, we asked for a moratorium on those fines. So we still have a few more years until the next CAP comes into operation. We know the next CAP is going to be around incentivised biology and looking after nature more. But for the next 2 years, we're still going to have a system that penalises farmers, which gets them to put out the glyphosate and gets them to cut down the trees and to take down their hedgerows. So there's something we can do at the moment as we develop these systems that will help bring more farmers on stream.
Yeah, I think there's some very perverse policy signals at the minute, which might be addressed. I think there's expanded eligibility rules, James.
Yeah,
you
they're
want to
looking
refer
at
to
the
that?
eligibility routes. But as you say, there is this gap at the moment that there needs to be something that they know they have a problem there, but the new rules won't come in until January 23. So there is, yeah.
But that kind of incentive is aimed at the moment, the penalty is aimed at conventional farmers.
Yeah.
So it could be a deciding point very quickly on whether a conventional farmer continues down the same road of pulling out the hedges and the ditches, or whether they decide to leave it. And that's without them getting a direct economic payment for what they've done. That's just not to be penalised for not going along and having 100% ryegrass or productive ground.
I always think, though, Thomas, and maybe a comment from you on this is, like, if that perverse policy wasn't there to rip them out, so a farmer was free to do it but didn't have to do it, do you think farmers would still do it? Do you think the majority would do it, or nobody would do it? People would just leave those bits of ground?
I think that real productive farmers that are only looking at square meterage of output and commodities, it wouldn't change their mind. I have no doubt there's 80% of conventional farmers out there that would have left the ground. There's a farmer down next to me and he's cleared 4 acres of what was lovely marsh and trees simply because he was docked a couple of pounds on his thing. And I see it all over the place. Like, you drive around the country, you see places sprayed continuously. And these are all very negative impacts. And we already know, we knew 5 years ago, we need to change these practices, but policy hasn't changed it. And I think that particular piece of policy, putting a moratorium on penalising people, could make a big difference in the next 2 years. Okay. It could save us a fortune of having to pay people to put back in the services that you're forcing them to take out.
Yeah. We go here and then we'll go so,
my point is similar to that my experience with the single farm payment is that anywhere I try to leave, for instance, late cutting for corncrake, because we have property in Mayo, they have no sympathy for me there in relation to the late cutting. If it looks uncut, you're going to be penalised, and that could end up being a percentage of my single farm payment. So my point is that there's no sympathy for the Farming for Nature fraternity at the moment. Also, a question I want to ask Tommy there is in relation to his rare orchid and how he's managing his rare orchid, the Irish Ladies Tresses orchid, on your farm without specifically getting a payment for it at the moment. And is it thriving, or is it under a bit of pressure over there?
The Irish Ladies Tresses, it's a little orchid that grows between the low water mark and the high water mark. The part on my farm that it grows on is actually Loch Allen, you might know, is a state lake. Okay? So you're what they call the beneficial occupier from the high water mark to the low water mark. Okay? So you won't get a farm payment on that area of ground, even though it's right beside you. But you can do whatever you want on it in terms of farming. But I manage it because that the little orchid is there on it. The management that it's getting is that come this time of year, we graze it off, or else we take a cut of silage or hay. But what happened this year in August was that there was a nice wildflower meadow on it, but it got flooded. There was a lot of rain in August. It got flooded, and when the water went back down, then the grass wasn't of any quality that cattle would eat or that. So we went in and we cut it with a mower, and we baled it up. So we're taking it away. So you're trying to reduce the nutrients in that area all the time. It's the opposite to, we'll say, conventional meadow, that you're trying to get more grass to grow on it. There you're reducing the nutrients on it. And it has been recorded this year on Loch Allen, the Ladies Tresses again. Would it benefit?
So, yeah, what Noel is asking is, if you were getting a payment to manage that, would it make any difference, or would it be of benefit, or would it,
Oh, sure. Any payment you get is a help.
Yes. I think
We'll not say no.
And I think you're taking out. I think we have to be aware of the Tommy Earley factor here as well. The point is, would another farmer across the wall manage it if there wasn't a payment? I think that's the real key thing. Yes.
Yeah.
Nero, that was Nero. James, do you want to come in, and then we've got...
Yeah, I was just saying that this is very much dependent on Tommy doing this, And if Tommy was doing this out of the goodness of his heart for all his farm, how attractive would that be to the next generation who have to rear a young family coming up on it as well to actually do that same thing? I think that's. I don't know what you answer to that, Tommy, but
Yeah,
if it was all like that, would it be? I know they have the enjoyment of doing that, but you also have to have parts of the farm that you actually bring the income in that will attract people in as well, because they have to make a living.
Yeah, because, well, look, it's either have two things. Either have a lot of money behind you that you don't have to get any income from it, or it has to pay its way.
Yeah.
So I have Motel and Eco tours. So that's tours of the farm. And it's very good for me to have, we said, like that orchid and different little things like that on the farm, so that when people come along, you can explain the story of it, and it makes your farm more interesting. So people will want to come to visit that farm.
That's a crucial point. So the autumn lady's tresses in this case is making you money, because that is a big sell to something they will not see anywhere else. It's unique in your context. What's rare is very valuable. Diamonds, So it is. So you have your diamonds on that piece of land. So the work that you had to do in terms of removing the bales, managing that, reducing the nutrients on it was quite labour intensive. But you're making the income back on that through the tourists that are coming to see that. I think that's a crucial point that's often missed, is that the management of that land there was generating an income within the farm business through the ecotourism side. So this is about diversification as well. I think we have to think of this. A more resilient farm will have more diverse sources of income. So you cannot be just dependent on the subsidies. You cannot be just dependent on the vagaries of the food market. You cannot just be dependent on ecotourism when we get a thing like COVID. So but this is the thing on these sort of systems. We need to have multiple. And then in terms of diversification, I think it needs to be resilience in terms of multiple income streams that you can survive shocks to the system.
But I suppose you also have to be conscious of the farm where the farmer doesn't want tourists or it's inaccessible, and to make sure that there's an incentive for that farmer to manage that. Jane, did you want to come in? And then
I always think, diversification is thrown as the answer to everything, and the reality of it at farm level is often very different.
Yeah.
With regard to labour and focusing on one thing, doing one thing well, you can spread yourself quite too thin over a lot of different things.
But I think this comes back to the training of the next generation coming up. We need to see that they can see these opportunities, and depending, they match their skills to the decisions they're making. So I think that would be key. I would never say that we should have to have a system built that every farmer would have to be involved in everything to actually be, but I think they all should pay for themselves. If you're producing a lot on one side, you should obviously make an income out of that, and the system should be resilient to shocks itself in the system level, not at individual level. But it is very important that young people coming up, particularly when we're teaching them in colleges, that they would see these multiple opportunities, and then they all won't have the skills or the inclination to do this, but the ones that do should be able to go into this.
So, Gerard?
I agree with just the two audience here in the context of GAC as good agricultural and environmental condition. Obviously, it was brought in for a reason, maybe abandonment or places not been farmed, but it probably is the most destructive vehicle for ecology and diversity on a lot of farms, where you look at a farm and you look at an area that may be a little bit overgrown, and there's no forgiveness in the context of an area of firs on a hillside, an area of woodland, hazel woodland. So it is, and hopefully the new CAP, I think they are moving in a direction, a positive direction in that regard. It's just a question for Jane there, just in the context of kind of good land, we'll call it, and the context of leaving. I'm looking at the room we're in here, and having an area around the fringes of good land, because obviously Jane is I think you were studying diverse swards or diverse grasslands, and looking at the impact of different fertility in that context. But even looking at say any type of farm on good land and having a fringe around the edge, because obviously there's a big push for hedgerows. You see where the IFA, if they've hedgerows, they think, oh geez, that's where we'll get our biodiversity payment. We have hedgerows, but often hedgerows fine, but what could sit in a fringe of 30 feet or 25 feet around the edge of a field, even if the rest was ryegrass, is immense. So I just wonder what's the chance of getting something like that into a system that, obviously if you reduce nitrogen levels on everything, productivity is lowering. But
Yeah, I suppose on the farm at home, we're very conscious of leaving. We have, I suppose, reseeded silage ground, the ground that we can reseed with the main goal to be more productive in terms of dry matter. But a lot of our pasture land would be low input to no input, traditional hay meadows, but we make an effort to leave edges along our silage ground, and you walk through them after cutting and they're alive with insects. And they also serve different purposes. In 2018, in the drought, we're a really dry farm for Cavan. All those little areas of wetland that we had left, sure, we could graze them and it kept us going. We didn't have to feed, we're lowly stocked. But I think when you go through the experience of the benefits of them at farm level, hopefully you can value them more. But
I think they could be brought into the bigger sphere, in a sense, brought in at a policy level or at a level that they're seen as valuable across a dairy farmer or whatever,
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in Gloss you did get a payment for your slightly diverse hay meadows, but on more intensive systems, I think it's productivity is their main focus. So.
It was easier for a dairy farmer with spreading slurry through an environmentally friendly manner get into Gloss than it was for, say, a high native value farmer outside a Natura habitat to get in. So there was a lot of rules that were put in place, even Gloss like that, and the standards are quite minimal in the context of diversity, in the context of grasslands.
Yeah, I suppose my PhD work that I'm involved with at the moment would be looking at very intensive grazing systems and looking for alternatives to your more common perennial ryegrass swards, but looking at sown multi-species mixes, so agronomically designed mixes as opposed to naturally diverse grassland, which I think people can get confused with.
Okay. Sorry, Bridget's yo-yoing over back at the microphone. Shirley?
Thanks. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask a few different bits, if you don't mind. James, you mentioned Costa Rica. Have they recently as well adopted rights for nature? And I wonder how would that play into, a situation where we said that nature actually had intrinsic rights, the right to thrive and survive, and thereby provide us with all these ecosystem services that we're talking about. And also then on a resilient landscape scale, I think Padraig was talking about the value of the wetlands in your system, as a nature-based solution for climate. And I'm involved in local authority and we talk about climate a lot, but it's extremely engineering focused, all of the solutions that have been put forward through the Carrow offices and through even the local authorities. They want to build and create and pour concrete and put in defences, whereas I'm looking at farmers and the landscape scale and thinking, well, actually, if farming was more nature-based and allowed to have much more nature there, the landscape would be much more resilient, both in diversity and its structural diversity, and thereby protect Ireland as a whole with a lot more public goods. And your services would then be a lot more valuable. And I wonder, should the argument be reframed slightly in that farmers can be those people that provide a resilient landscape for Ireland and resilience in Irish society going forward.
Okay, so maybe James wants to respond to the first thing, then Padraig, we might chat to you.
Yeah, I think it's growing up in farming too, most of the psyche is sort of, and your behaviour is built on producing the food, and a lot of farmers would see themselves as food producers, so I think it will take a bit of work around this. I think more and more farmers are seeing this, to see farming as more than just food production. I think that's a big behavioural change that's needed. And of course, that's what has been pushed ever since the start of the state. What was the byline at the start? Was it one more cow, one more sow, one more acre under the plough, So when we're coming from a psyche of that over the last 3 or 4 generations, where we were coming out of food shortages, famine and hunger after the World War, that has seeped into the psyche. That's what is constituted as a better farmer, So we need to sort of change the narrative around what is a better farming. And I think in terms of the Costa Rican example, I don't know an awful lot about it. I have to learn more about it. But I think it's coming from a very different psyche in that it didn't have that interplay at the start, and it was more inbuilt in the rights of nature and the environment were more built into that sort of the society that built up in that country separate. So there's a lot of things going on, but I think for us to change and bringing in rights for nature on top of it, maybe an additional complication that mightn't necessarily be needed at the moment, but I definitely think we would probably be working towards that, but it's generations down the line. But I think the first thing we would need to work on is reframing what is seen as a better farm, because it's drilled into us all working in agriculture from when we're that high. You hand the land on in a better state. But what we're defining now as better, and the definition of what's better is where this fight will be won and lost, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. We're going to go to Sean for a question, but I think possibly those things can happen in parallel as well, this notion of the rights of nature and valuing nature. Talking a bit about the hard engineering versus your soft engineering solutions to climate, I mean, what you do effectively is making that contribution forward. Do you want to comment on that?
I suppose if we roll back a small bit, we'll say most of our funding that comes to the agriculture is coming through CAP. Right, and that budget is being reduced, okay, and even in the next round, it's looking at on the Pillar 1, 20 to 25% of each farmer's money is going to be retained, okay, and then there'll be a scoring system for that, and then they'll get it back. Now, I have a bit of a difficulty with, if you do a job for me and I hold back 25%, and I get you to do something else and I still give you the same amount of money. I think it's very much like the ad if he put his hand in my pocket. And so that's going to be looking at self-funding of environmental services. There's millions and millions and millions being taken off every one of us on a carbon budget. Okay, and I think that there's got to be funding towards how eco-services are provided. As well, you know, because that's one thing. In relation to your question about the hard engineering against the soft engineering, you know, we done a sea farm survey when we had the massive flooding in 2010 and 11, and it's still going on. Okay, and about 2 months later, I watched a program on BBC, and they were planting trees along the Yorkshire, in the Yorkshire, to mitigate flood for 25 years' time. So they were all proactive, planting trees, withholding and that. And there is a massive amount. It's well proven that the most eco-rich, biodiverse systems are wet woodlands and wetlands. And we have loads of wetlands. And we can store water on these, because if you look at, we'll say, with the amount of animals that's housed and everything, you drive halfway through the country and there's not an animal in it from October until April, the end of April, unless you're in good land like in Kilkenny or some places like that. So we have the ability to take the animals off these lands. We don't have to have that water going in people's doors. We should be able to design the system to withhold that land. And be able, instead of spending all these millions on flood defences, that farmers get a storage area for their
So I think so. It's about recognising, but also putting a value on those services. I want to go down to Sean and then Bridget for questions.
A couple of questions I just wanted to ask was, you know, before we even start, I think we have to stop talking about the word subsidy. You know, what farmers are getting paid for nowadays are public goods. They're not being subsidised. It's almost like it's a farmer dole, it's something for nothing. It's not. I think we have to get away from that. That's the first thing. But I think one of the big problems is a lot of the environmental policies that are there, and I'm hoping the EIPs are going to change this now, is the farmer's probably the last person that's actually told what's going to happen, if you know what I mean. The rules are so, in many ways, stupid. Like the best example, I think, is a GLAS scheme. A friend of mine a couple of years ago done it. He was rotational grazing his cattle, and he had applied the grass scheme, and the inspector came in and he said, that's the best example of a hedge and grown, but I'm giving you a 100% penalty because you don't have a fence around it. You know, the madness of the systems, and this is one of the problems is, and it's interesting what James was saying, that coming up with new ideas for local levels is, ecologists look at it from an ecology perspective, farmers look at it from a very, very different perspective, and we haven't been able to meet those properly. This whole idea of the sectors for the high nature value is a really interesting thing for what might happen in Roscommon might be slightly different than the rules around what might happen in Cavan, which would be, it's a really, really interesting take on things. But it's going to take an awful lot of bedding in on that. And the only other thing then about measurement tools, we've talked so much about carbon measurement and everything else, but maybe we need to simplify it further down and say what we need to measure is soil biology, healthy soil. Because if you get your soil operating at a healthy level, all the accidental thing, for example, it was great to see this man talk about water infiltration, because to me flood mitigation is so easy, and it's not about concrete, it's about soil health and getting soil water infiltration. But at the same time, biodiversity is an accident of good soil biology. So you could almost have a measurement tool that would do everything. And maybe that's where we need to go to. And I'm not talking about, and I don't want to be overly critical about this new soils program, but from what I understand, it's only measured in 15 centimetres. Like, there's no point in measuring carbon if you're talking about the first 15 centimetres, because that's not going to be of any benefit to where this carbon is going to be stored. You're going to have to go down to probably the full 60 centimetres or a metre. But I suppose it is a start, and we're getting away from just the NPs and Ks. We're measuring a lot, not more, so I don't want to be overly critical. But it would be great. I'm just commenting more to show the fact that we probably need to look at, Jane mentioned it, on the farmers won't, very, we'll say high-yielding farmers aren't going to give a hoot about the £5,000 payment, particularly now because it looks like it's going to be income forgone anyway, so it's not even that valuable probably for a lot of people in many ways. But one of the things that we discussed this, we solved all the world. If we had an hour longer in the pub last night, we would have probably got to solving climate change completely, I think, Brendan. But it was a really interesting discussion among a mix of farmers about how we impart knowledge. And I was filming for Biofarm during the week there, and one of the lads from Base made a really interesting point. He said it's not about knowledge transfer. He said it's about knowledge sharing, farmers talking to farmers. And this guy is a very progressive biological farmer, but one of the things he said when he was finished, and I thought was really interesting, and it's about quality of life for farmers as well. Sometimes farmers is drudgery, and as one guy said to me, I hate farming. It's nothing but drudge. I work my arse off to get ahead, and nature knocks me back another step, and I'm back, and I never seem to get ahead where I can make money when I'm working. But your man told me a really interesting story when we're finishing off film, and he said, you know, he says, I'm a full-time farmer, only working half-time now. Because his system of, he's reduced his inputs by 70%. He's gone to a completely different thing. He has far more time on my hands. It's like a dairy farmer that went to once a day milking once said, the cows got used to it quicker than me. I don't know what I'm doing for the last 6 weeks since he went into it, you know, because he had all his evenings free. So, you know, I do think we need to look at things slightly different. But maybe the farmer needs to be put in the centre of everything that's been made in the future.
Great, thanks very much, Sean. Do you want to respond briefly, James?
Yeah,
and then we go to Bridget.
What you just said there is crucial, and in them, the scoring systems we're trying to come up with now, the holy grail is we have these three ideas in our head in terms of what we're measuring in the scoring systems. It's what we call the ecological integrity or ecological quality from the science. We call it the soil quality or soil integrity, exactly like you're saying, and the hydrological quality or integrity in terms of the interaction with the waters, the rivers, the streams, the wetlands, etc. So it's them three things we're trying to, but then always, that's the science part, but then always, since the main ones that are going to be managing this land are the farmer. So we have to think, and this is from the Burn, we go farmer-centred then. So we have these three big ideas in our heads, and then we work with the farmer saying that in this area, if your soil looks like this or has these qualities, it is going to be better quality. So we actually, working with the EIPs, come up with the actual measurement tools with the farmers. So I think you don't actually impose a measurement tool on anybody. You bring the science and the farmer together to understand what's going on in the ground, and then you build up the scoring system. That's what all the ones have done. So I think It is that, but that's bringing it to the next level. So we're trying to work on that, you know.
Okay, we've less than 8 minutes left. So Bridget, maybe, and if there's 2 other questions, we'll take them and get the panel maybe to sum up. And Dorina then, yeah.
On what Sean was saying, and then loop it back to the original kind of question, which was paying for ecosystem services. There's a concern that I have kind of sitting somewhere that if we're just paying for individual services, carbon sequestration or carbon storage or whatever, that the world of extractive, the industry approach to that is just going to come flying in like they did in Leitrim and just dump huge amounts of Sitka spruce and hey presto, we're still sequestering, you know what I mean? But the biodiversity, the water quality, everything else kind of collapses. And I was wondering if that kind of starting point would be that people are actually paid to regenerate your ecosystem, whatever that ecosystem is that you find yourself in, whether it's the burn, whether it's, you know what I mean, good agricultural land, wherever it is, the primary thing that you actually get rewarded for is restoring or regenerating the ecosystem, and then whatever quantifiable services come out of that, that's an extra payment. But that you don't just look straight away and kind of go, I'm just going to, you know, like really focus on paying for this. It's if you look at your own body, it's kind of like saying I'm going to pump a whole lot of kind of energy into making sure I've got a healthy heart, but it really doesn't matter if I've gone into kidney failure. You know, that whole kind of system needs to be running really well, and then we take the value out of it, but rather than just looking at what can we take of value out of a system.
Okay, thanks. And can we come here to Dorina? And then one more question maybe before. Yeah.
I think for those, we have so many inspections during the year, it depends on how biodiversity farmers and so on. We're all on a journey together to try and, you know, to fill all the, you know, get further on the path. But what I think would be great help to us, and maybe it's there, I'm just missing it, is instead of when the inspections and ticking those boxes and everything, but if there was something built in that the following year that you could see what progress you'd made, that it was actually documented what progress you'd made on the various things that Sean had thing. This has been very frustrating. It's for years now, and I think that could be enormously helpful to all of us who are on this journey to see what, you know, where we've made a bit of progress and where we could think. Now, the other point I wanted to make was that about compost. I would love to see compost somehow or rather, I'm not sure what's happening in the agriculture and horticulture colleges at the moment, whether the students are being encouraged or being taught to encourage to make compost as an absolutely integral part of the system, because certainly for us, we make compost on, you know, quite a small scale, but quite a large scale in comparison to some other farms. And it is such an essential part of building up the fertility of the soil. And the thing that I don't think I have to say that to anybody here, everybody knows this, but basically, the thing that has been most striking is how the more fertile the soil, the less problem we have with disease. I mean, obviously the plants are stronger and stronger, and we have almost a kind of an embarrassment of slugs. I mean, people are always asking us when they come visit the farm, you know, what do you do about slugs? I think they think I'm out in my nightie at night picking off the slugs too. But it's just because the compost has made such a difference, and compost in combination with seaweed has made such a difference to the fertility of the soil. Yet, you know, in a way, so no farmer around us makes compost, not part of their system whatsoever. But and you think of all the waste that's wasted by not going back into the soil to a great extent. And just one other final little thing. This is like a smaller thing that very often people are saying, well, what? You know, who are not necessarily in farming, but all want to try to think how they could make a difference. But certainly in a lot of the farmers' markets in the US and in other places, in the UK as well, local people are encouraged to bring in their food waste to a central thing in the local farmers' market, and then that's taken and composted by somebody who's making compost in the area, and then they can either buy it back or get a little bag back. So sometimes people would like to know a small thing they could do in their own lives that are not necessarily farming, but.
Thanks, Lorena. Yeah, it's really interesting. I met somebody last night, actually, again in the pub, who was using coffee grinds to grow fungi for ragu sauce. So it's this whole recycling. Jared Egan, I would have brought him in to talk about compost, but not right now. But there's a whole conversation we could have around that. One last question here, Bridget, I promised, and then, yeah.
Really just a comment. I can see the science and I can see the farmer. Doreen is very right on the monitoring, but I can also see another layer of consultant that the farmer has to pay to monitor maybe, or another layer of inspection. And I think the quality of the consultant who is advising the farmer is poor.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. So there's the whole capacity issue, I think. Yeah. Well, we'd really have an ambition, I think, James, not just us, but people we work with, that the farmer, him or herself, could actually do a lot of this monitoring. And when we're designing these scorecards, we're designing them in a way that the farmer can actually apply them, him or herself, so that they only need to be checked every 3 or 4 years. Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a critically important point. And just to pick up on one of Drina's first points about feedback loops, you're dead right. And I think, again, in the Burn with the scoring system, we show the score from the previous years and this year's score and give a couple of lines of recommendations as to, why the score is going up or why it's going down, what you can do. But I think that feedback loop is really critical.
And I think crucial on that, Brendan, as well, is that we want to, the existing inspection system is based about compliance with a complete large set of rules that a lot of them, as you pointed out, are complete and utter nonsense. So if we're going for a different system, we've got rid of all them rules and the need for them inspections as well. And we replace it with a system that is actually working together, geared towards results with clear visions of what we want to do. And then it's about the actual, not an inspection process, but an actual knowledge sharing process to come to an actual end goal that everyone needs, a society is willing to pay for and that the farmer is delivering. See, I think that's the key mindset we miss in this. And the trouble is, during the transition, we have the inspections of the old process, we have this of the new system, and it looks more complex and more, as you would say, leakage out of the system. Our system works if you transform it and don't bring the baggage and inspections of the old system. I always remember in the Burn, when you transferred over, the big thing was on how are we going to penalise it? You don't need an inspection process to penalise. What we're doing here is about incentive. So this is at every step. When you want systems change, you have to change the entire system. You cannot just change little bits of it because it looks like a failure and it will fail. So that's just a bit of a rant because I'm stuck in this now at the moment. It's killing me.
We're going to give you one last shout in a minute, James. But maybe for the panel, is there any reflections on what you've heard this morning? I mean, we're touching on one small dimension of paying for ecosystem services. We haven't even talked about the market, the food market, like putting a proper price on food. We haven't talked about, private investment in the payment of it. There's a ton of stuff we could talk about. But from what you've heard this morning, Tommy, to start with you, have you any reflections or closing comments?
Well, I suppose we're all here and we're all talking, but we have to look to the future and how the systems is going to pan out and what's going to happen. But I've read a book there recently by Dr. Lorna Gold. It's called Climate Generation. And she's a Scottish scientist. She's living in Dublin. She's a young family. And I think it's really worth anybody getting their hands on it and reading it, because she has gone round, she's been dealing with the top 15,000 scientists in the world she's done a lot of work with Socra over the whole food question as to where the future will be. And what it's going to be is going to be a locally produced plant-based diet. Yeah. And that food to be consumed in the locality. Like what are we doing at the moment? We're bringing fruit and vegetables halfway around the world. And what's any fruit or vegetable? It's 70 or 80% water. So we're bringing water around the world. When you stand back and look at it, you just have to scratch your head and say, "Hello, now, how did we get this so wrong?" So yeah. So I think to go back, but developing that local markets, I think that the key is community. That everybody in the community who can produce what they're good at. Communities coming together, producing food for that local community. That's where the future is.
Okay, so it's weaving that eco back into the social and vice versa. Jane, would you have any reflections on this morning or in general?
Yeah, I suppose in general, I only started farming maybe 5 years ago and didn't have any experience. And I think be positive, to end it. You know, even in the past week, we've seen a real recognition of a lot of the practices that everyone in this room does. So I think, not to be negative and all doomsday about it, I think, you know, there's a lot of positive things, and we're finally seeing support for certain sectors like the organic sector being recognised, and hopefully it'll all come to fruition over the next few years. And I suppose it's encouraging to see EIPs and people like Knots and other people doing knowledge that's not available to the more conventional farmer, and empowering farmers to go and look for that knowledge themselves, and not rely on advisory services or people, you know, just go and look for the knowledge yourself, I think is important.
And as a young farmer, Jane, are you excited about the future? Do you see it as being like...
I think you know, there's so many challenges facing food production. I think that's probably the exciting thing about it. But yeah, I think
challenges and opportunities. Okay, thanks very much. And Padraig, any final comments?
Well, I suppose if we look what we're doing going forward, we're looking back now at how it used to be done. And they done it right, you know, it was the circle met up, you know, and within the farms and everything, you know, people were so self-sufficient, and to hear that 6 out of 40, you know, only eat some of their own food, you know, tells you that there's a total disconnect, you know. And I think we have another total disconnect, because we're very much now on policy and rules and what we're going to stop and what's not good. But we've got to remember, we have a farming system here. We can produce the best food at a low carbon in comparison to a lot of other countries that have to add all their concentrates and grow other foods to, you know, even if you fly in over Spain and you listen to the argument about greening and you go on holidays and you look over a plane and you're after flying out of Ireland and you say, we have a greening on our agriculture, and there's not a bit of green here, and these are farming in the same European context. And you look at us and we have the finest bogs, we have the biggest percentage of bogs in any country. And we're bringing in our peat for our compost from Latvia, and we're doing good by stopping it here for our, you know. So there's an old saying, you can't make an omelette without breaking an egg, and you can't live without having a footprint behind you. But there's a positive, you know, we've got to look at what we're doing that we're deeming not good. But by stopping it, the other is a lot worse of what we're doing. So there's a lot of common sense and balance to be brought in to some of the things that we're doing as well. Just that's on a broader scale. That's not on supporting farming and money and you know. But some of the things, you know, I go into a hardware shop now, and I just looked at one yesterday. 450 kgs of kennel dried timber, €189. Okay, that the only part of Ireland is now that it's sitting on ground. It was grown in another country, it was kennel dried in another country, it was flown in here, it was put in a lorry, it was brought down, it was put in a shop, and it'll be burned here. And we have a forestry programme that we were planting 8,000 hectares, and we have an ambition to plant 8,000 hectares, and we're down to 2,000. So while we're thinking that we're doing all these things, that's good. You know, we need our timber for our post, our rail, our pallet, our roofs, you know, our matches, our paper. And are we going to import all our problems now and create a bigger carbon footprint when we have all these things? We have the best climate in the world to grow timber, and we're stuck in a logistics problem with paperwork. You know, so we've got to sit down and look and see, while we're doing this, how can we do it good ourselves, and how can we support ourselves, support our jobs, support our economy, support ourselves, and also have that, by doing these woodlands and all that, we are creating ecosystems as well. So we can do it if we just, but we need to get our heads together.
It's done right. James, closing comment?
Yeah, there's so many big issues at play here with all this, in terms of, I think it's transformation of our food and land use system at a global level. But one of the things I was just looking at this morning that came on the timeline on Twitter when I got up first thing was the it was a video from 2010, a TEDx talk. I can't think of exactly now. I think it was the Stockholm Institute. I'm trying to think back what came up with my first thing this morning. But it was looking at planetary boundaries and how we're exceeding the planetary boundaries and squeezing the Earth all the time, and that we cannot basically live the way we're living with 20% of the richest people in the world living and utilising the resource we have. And all of us in that room are in that 20%, you know, that are using up the resources of other places, you know. So we have to transform our food system in Europe, you know. We have to actually recognise that systems change has to occur. We have to get that systems change right. And one of the things I worry about at the moment is that continuous resistance that we've seen in Ireland and across Europe to change. You know, I know farmers on the ground are worried about better the devil you know, but as you say, Padraig, there, nothing we're doing in Ireland at the moment with land use is correct. You know, we're planting the trees in the wrong place. And the reason that we don't have a forestry programme now is that the forest sector continuously want to plant the trees in the wrong place, as opposed to deep peats on bloody shallow peats with clay soils. I'm sorry, I'm going to get annoyed again, you know. And the reason we have so much paperwork in place, you know, is that someone said, well, I cannot tell them we cannot put it on there, but we're going to sort of put the paperwork to stop them doing it. Just say to people, we want trees planted in this type of landscape to do this, you know. It's not rocket science, you know. So, and I think even within this room here, and working as a scientist, I've attended, Gwen has sent me on civil dialogue groups to Brussels over the last 8 years. I've been sitting in rooms for the last 8 years, every maybe 12 or 15 months with farm organisations and environment NGOs. And there's going to be no solutions coming out of there, you know.
Yeah, but we've done huge damage to our forest sector.
Yeah.
I don't know how much money or what you will convince a farmer to plant now, because number one, he has to look for planning permission to get it. Number two, he'll have to look for planning permission to take it down. And number three, he doesn't know what disease is going to come in, or will he ever get to plant it, or will he ever get to cut it down? And no one is asking the question where the timber is coming in, from, because they don't care as long as they get the timber.
Coming to the solutions, we know all these problems. We have to change the system. We have to accept that from a starting point. But even in that talk this morning, what they were saying is, he gave multiple examples. I put it up on the Twitter feed this morning, people want to follow it. He actually looked at multiple examples from Africa, from Europe, on urban side, on land use side, and all the solutions that we've seen here in the last few days as well were come up with by local communities working together, realising where they fitted with global solutions, and they're coming up with the solutions at local. And if we can solve it everywhere at local level, then we can actually solve the global problems. But the big issue is then on the policy side in this, the system has to be created that facilitates and enables these local solutions. And I think in Ireland, this is what we've been trying to do with the examples of the EIPs over the last number of years. We've proven it has worked at local level. We can make these payments for ecosystem works. We can encourage ecotourism. We can, at an individual farm level, the farmer can know the right trees in the right place where they could incorporate them in if they were given a target. So we can do it. But what's wrong is we have to transform the whole system to enable that local action, you know. So, and I think we're transforming it slowly, not fast enough. But anyone that's in this room now, and if you go out and hear anyone in the next 3 or 4 weeks pushing for the status quo, don't accept it, you know. So and would accept that something has to change to make it better, okay? And that's the final message, but it's just, we're running out of time.
We certainly are. We're actually over time. But anyway, just can I suppose I think it's daunting, but it's also possible as well at the same time. And I think what we've tried to do this morning and this afternoon is to kind of look at that big picture of reframing what farming and land use is and should be, and this notion of the farmer as being almost the first responder to these crises around climate and biodiversity and food and nutrition, and what stimulants are, how do we incentivize and encourage farmers to do that. So we just talked about the paying for ecosystem services and the knowledge transfer and things like that. And I think there's other pieces as well. But I'd like to really thank our two panels this morning. They're absolutely wonderful. Their eloquence, their grounded knowledge, and their ideas and inspiration has been really fantastic. And thanks also to the audience for sharing back.